Welcome to Books of Titans. I'm Jason Staples together with Eric Rostad, and this podcast is dedicated to the influences of influencers. The books that have helped shape prominent inventors, business leaders, athletes, intellectual scientists, and others. And we'll talk about what makes these books so important and influential, and at least attempt to have an intelligent discussion about these important works. Today we're going to cover the book Heraclitean Fire by Erwin Chargaff, a book focused on the life and times and science and views of science of Erwin Chargaff. As for who recommended the book, it was Eric Weinstein, the managing director of Thiel Capital, PhD in mathematical physics from Harvard, research fellow at the Mathematical Institute of Oxford University, and he gave some interesting reasons for recommending this book.
I'm going to read this from page 526 of Tools to Titans. I have another weird recommendation, which is the book Heraclitean Fire by Erwin Chargaff, who effectively shorted Watson and Crick. He told Watson and Crick that he didn't think that they were very good or very smart, and that they didn't know their chemistry. They weren't qualified to work on DNA, etc. It turned out that they got it right, and he got it wrong. When I heard that there was somebody out there who bet against Watson and Crick, I thought, well, this just is going to be the laugh of the century. But it turned out that it was just to short these guys required another genius. He writes about trying to suppress these guys and failing because they were right and he was wrong. He has enough presence of mind to struggle with that. So I thought that was a cool reason why he liked the book. And I thought there was a lot to like about the book. So should we head into our overview?
Yeah, let's go ahead and do the overview.
Okay. Yeah, I had never heard of this book and had never heard of Erwin Chargaff, but I loved it. And the book has a pretty sour look on the future, but to me it was just an absolutely delightful book to read. It was one of those where I didn't want it to end, and I was just overall pleasantly surprised for not ever having heard of the book or anything like that. So had you heard of this one?
I had not.
And had you heard of Chargaff?
No, everybody knows Watson and Crick, but nobody really pays a whole lot of attention to Chargaff's name outside of those who really work in this area. So yeah, I was not as familiar with him, but done a little bit of looking around since then. Very interesting dude.
Yeah. Yeah, and so it kind of follows a similar feel of the Surely You're Joking, Mr. Feynman, in the sense that we hear from a couple different scientists, and so this book is kind of a half autobiography and then half commentary on the way that science is going, especially in the university system. So it was neat in a lot of different aspects, just of him growing up, and we'll get into that a little later. But that part of it, and then growing up overseas and coming to the U.S., teaching at Columbia University, and just a lot of neat stories. Not the craziness, I guess, of Mr. Feynman, but certainly some entertaining stories nonetheless.
Yeah, in a lot of ways, this book it's similar to Feynman's work in that he's similarly independently minded and sort of iconoclastic and different things like that. But there's a real difference in tone in this one. This book is a lot more. There's a tinge of sadness and loss that runs through this whole book. He's much more pessimistic, probably, than anybody else we've read so far this semester, and it's really interesting to see the difference there of such an independent thinker who is, he's quasi-mystical, and at the same point really pessimistic and sort of jaded about everything, but without coming across as overly bitter. So that's a tough balance to strike, and again, really interesting perspective on a lot of different things, particularly as pertains to science throughout this book.
and to U.S. culture and U.S. university culture, having come from the outside, he has some pretty funny insights and commentary on that as well.
Yeah.
So we'll get into our favorite quotes. My first one is the conviction that I shall not die, non omnis moriar, so often repeated to me in the stillness of the night, had less to do with the cry of glory-drunk Horace and his stainless steel monument than the incandescent loveliness of Mozart's music. So this conviction that that it doesn't end here, that there's got to be something, more. He felt that the most in listening to Mozart, and I thought that was awesome, and definitely can relate. I love Mozart's music, love his operas. I love listening to his whole operas when I'm working, and just think there's something just unbelievable about his music, and so really related to that quote.
All right, I'm going to go ahead and start with the contemporary world always rejects the best and the worst and takes to mediocrity as to a mother's breast.
Yeah.
So he has a lot to say in this, and actually there's a lot of tonal and also subject similarities here to Alexander Solzhenitsyn's observations, particularly of the West. But in terms of his sort of outlook on the world, he's similar to Solzhenitsyn in many respects. And this reminds me of Solzhenitsyn's, in a number of places in the book, reminded me of Solzhenitsyn's discussions of fashion and his and how the crowd, the crowd dynamics, and basically the herd mentality in scholarship and in media and elsewhere, and how basically everybody just takes to whatever the rest of the herd is doing. And basically Chargaff throughout is saying, yeah, well, everybody loves the mediocre stuff, and lots of it gets put out there, and that's what ends up getting consumed. But the great stuff ultimately, so often gets rejected until far too late, or doesn't get recognized at all. So he's pretty pessimistic about that. But I've found this to be the case in, I work in a different area of academia and do research in another area, in other areas. But I find that a lot of his complaints about university life, academia, research, and the incentives thereof are really, really, they ring true probably more now than they did in 1978 when this was published. And I've found more often than not that, the people who can produce lots of mediocre work, those people get jobs, and those people do, really well. They, especially if they're capable of networking and convincing people to that they're decent at what they do. The mediocre have no problems. It's the people who really are on bleeding edge. Some of those people are the ones who have the hardest times getting jobs, because they're not part of that larger crowd. They're pushing forward, and so job committees and such will look at them and go, well, this doesn't sound like the other stuff that's going on out there. That's because this person's brilliant. And that's instead, let's go to Safehold mediocrity, where nobody stands out and nobody's in danger of any of it being too bad or too good, and that's partly because people have a hard time judging between something that doesn't look like everything else could be either really bad, it could be the worst, or it could be the best, but you've got to have great judgment to be able to discern the two, and that's harder to do. So it's a lot easier to just stick with the crowd and go with mediocrity.
Yeah. I was looking forward to your commentary on the book, just with the insight into university life that the author has, and then that you're deep in that world, and so I thought you would enjoy those parts of the book. So my next quote is I was referring earlier to his commentary on the United States. This was one of those quotes. I was afraid to go to a country that was younger than most of Vienna's toilets. Speaking of the United States, of course.
Yeah, well, we still are, and at least in some areas. Okay, another one, and this one's one that I couldn't help but think of Kevin Kelly when I read this one. He said, "What I did conclude after he, sort of had this idea that things were going up to really negative ends, and the end did not, the apocalyptic expectations that he had didn't necessarily come to pass when he thought. But he said, what I did conclude is that the future always is a little farther away than it appears to the prophetic eye. On the whole, professional pessimists prove right at the end if one does not hold them too tightly to a timescale." So Kelly, of course, says, the optimists are the ones who shape the world. And Chargaff basically comes back and says, yeah, well, that may be true in the short run, but the pessimists are right in the end.
Yeah, following that line of the future kind of permeates throughout this book.
Yeah, I'll go with one other one that builds on that too, because he is constantly critiquing what he sees as overweening pride in the way that in the direction of the modern of the natural sciences in his day, and how that's progressing, and it has progressed since then. He says, "Man is only strong when he is conscious of his own weakness. Otherwise, the eagles of heaven will eat his liver, as Prometheus found out. No eagles of heaven anymore, no Prometheus. Now we get cancer instead, the prime disease of advanced civilizations." Okay, then.
Yeah. My next one, in the Sistine Chapel, where Michelangelo depicts the creation of man, God's finger and that of Adam are separated by a short space. That distance I called eternity, and there I felt I was sent to travel. That was pretty cool.
Yeah, it's a good sentiment. And again, he really likes to remind his reader that as many explanations as we have of natural phenomena and all this, one of the other quotes that he has is, even the most exact of our exact sciences float above axiomatic abysses that cannot be explored. And he wants to constantly remind the reader that, yeah, we may feel like we're really discovering the essence of things, but the reality is we don't understand. We don't really get it. We can predict certain stuff, and we can model different things, but we don't really understand this stuff. There's an eternal gap between what we can know and and the fullness of the truth, and really understanding nature, which gets to the title of the book too. So, yeah, it's some interesting stuff.
And he kind of throughout wanting there to be a humility in approaching the sciences, and then not delving too far then beyond where we should go. And there's some interesting things on that. And then also, he really did not like how things were getting so segmented. He thought that people should have more of a broad view of science, but the way he saw it going forward in his lifetime was that people were getting so focused on one specific area that it wasn't going in a good direction.
Yeah, and it has gotten only more tightly specialized now than it was then, which he predicts. I mean, he says it's going to continue to fragment and segment to the place where it's not science anymore. It's just you're looking at such a narrow sliver of things that can't really integrate with anything else. And you may not know the basics of all these various other aspects of what should be one unified discipline. You're just working so narrowly on your thing that really nobody cares about. And doesn't have any real impact, but you're finding a way to get paid for it.
Yeah, and then those people become famous because of that focus, and then he hates seeing those same people then talk about like popular topics, and because they're an expert in this very defined field, all of a sudden they can talk about all these other things, and he's like, they have no clue what they're talking about. But
Richard Dawkins.
Yeah.
Hey, he's I won't question his capacity as a biologist, but when he ventures out to talk about lots of other things, he's an untrained amateur, and in many cases, you know, spits out what Chargaff likes to call twaddle. But
that should be your book word of the book.
yeah, I like that. I like that word there.
What?
But yeah. So and a couple other actually quotes that get to that taking to mediocrity, and these are Solzhenitsyn type quotes, where he says a society that consists only of slaves must invent a master. This master might be called will of the people, public opinion, or something like it, but he does not, of course, exist. And you know, he's really in numerous places just sort of distraught about how free people are finding ways to bind themselves up in little prisons of their own design, and particularly with fashions and these sorts of things. And he goes on to say, and all this without a formal ministry of propaganda. No Goebbels is needed. The system functions almost automatically, so Beelzebub may have had a hand in it after all, as in all automats. The ways of the devil are so obvious that we do not see them. And he's talking here about the way that media shapes fashions and shapes opinions and so on, such that people come to like and come to believe in various things that really aren't. It has nothing to do with the quality of things. They're just doing what they're told, and the media cycle continues to foster outrage and scorn and all sorts of other things to basically steer a populace that is in service of really no one. They've just invented a master called public opinion that, you know, by taking regular polling and these sorts of things, you shape where things go, and no one's actually governing it. It just actually it just continues to degrade, as he puts it, and it happens, you know, and he finds this to be an incredible phenomenon.
Well, and speaking of Goebbels, I
Imagine
just
what he would have
realized
thought of the internet, by the way.
yeah. Well, I just realized we skipped over about the author.
Oh, yes.
So he was Austrian born, and his mother was killed. And he has a quote saying, having been deported into nothingness. So she was deported, and then I don't think he ever really heard what exactly happened after that.
Well, the presumption is that she died either on the trip or in a concentration camp, that she was deported by the Nazis and died at their hands for sure.
Yeah. And then Chargaff himself, he was of the age where he was not of fighting age for either of the two world wars. So he was in between, where he was too young for the first one and then too old for the second one. So he didn't fight. But he's best known for being professor and chairman of the biochemistry department at the College of Physicians and Surgeons at Columbia University. So that's a little bit about the author. We missed that part of the beginning there, but kind of falls in with.
Yeah, and actually, it's fascinating to hear his reflections on pre-war Austria, and particularly pre-World War I Austria, and how there were vestiges of what he regards as a more civilized world that were still there, but they were rotting to the core, and then eventually they were cast off. And for him, the progression into modernity that you see in the 20th century, that progression that starts with World War I, really, where the old nobility gets overthrown. I mean, World War I guess, is another step in it, but it's the thing that really shatters the world and brings it into a totally different era. You know, you have the communist revolution that comes along with it. You have, you know, in Russia, all these other things that quickly follow on the heels of what happens with this, but in World War I, to where the old nobilities that had governed the world for centuries, millennia really, in various ways. I mean, nobilities traded in some places, and one would conquer another, but you had sort of noble classes ruling. That changes in the 20th century, and he doesn't have all that positive things to say necessarily about all those nobilities and all that, but he does seem to regard the the prior order as superior to the what he sees as more or less disorder that follows upon that, and all of the culminating for him in the atrocities of World War II and Vietnam and all these other things, where he's saying, this is the bloodiest century in human history, and we think we've suddenly become more civilized, but in fact, it's worse than it ever has been. And so he's lamenting this throughout, and it's interesting to hear his perspective on this, because it's very much contrarian, but he got some point. He's got some really good points to make there.
Yeah, and he was also in Germany between the world wars, so he almost was firsthand view there. He was in Berlin in the early 30s, so firsthand view of what was leading up to World War II.
Yeah, he got to see what led right up to World War I in Austria, and then what led right up to World War II in Germany, and then he recognized when he was in Germany, like, probably better leave.
It's time to go.
Yeah, It's time to go. And then he tried to get his mother out, and sadly, he expresses grief and frustration and anger and a little bit of bitterness, and rightly so, that his efforts to get his mother out were resisted, and ultimately it cost her life. So he got to see all this firsthand.
Okay, which may explain some of the negative outlook.
Yeah, some of his pessimism. Yeah, just a little bit. So I'm going to go with another couple quotes here before we get into your favorite words. This one seems relevant to what we were just talking about. Science has taught us that man is an animal, a view often expressed by people wishing to excuse the bestialities they perpetrate.
Yeah.
Oof. And that actually is in line with something else that he says, where he's a scientist, but he has problems with with using science as the as a foundation as sort of mythological foundation for how people live and so on. And he says elsewhere, he says the terror, this is of where science is headed, has not been removed. It has increased, for we have begun to define life by its very automatism. He repeatedly makes this point that we don't really understand what life even is. We're studying something that we don't know what it is. We can't really define it. It's beyond our comprehension of even of what the thing is. And in order to study it, he makes the point that C.S. Lewis often makes, that to really study things in the way that you do in science, you have to kill them. And he's like, we can't study live things in the way, in a way that really gives us any sort of hard evidence about anything. In order to get that, we have to kill it, which means we're not actually studying the live thing itself at all. We're just studying something related to it, but it's not the living thing. But he says the majesty of the book Genesis has been replaced by a technology of biopoiesis, which may well make the centuries to come into an undreamed of nightmare. Which is fascinating to hear someone say this. I mean, this is a guy whose discovery of base complementarity, or what we now call base pairing, paved the way for Watson and Crick's model, a double helical model. One of the pioneering biochemists of the 20th century, who's saying, as we move into this substitution of scientific ways of thinking about origins and human origins and what life is, and naturalist, he doesn't use this word, but naturalism, as naturalism substitutes for the old myths like Genesis, we may find that instead of getting the optimistic, look, we can finally, edit our genes and cure things like cancer, he says, no, actually, it's a lot more likely that we just make room for ourselves to become horrible, nightmarish monsters that do the sorts of things that the Nazis did, and far worse, because we'll have better technology to do them, and we'll have less mooring to the old myths that kept us human. So that's one of the interesting critiques that he makes throughout this, and I found that fascinating.
Yeah. I just have one quote left, and it's a short one. I've always tried to maintain my amateur status. And that
was one of mine. I'm going to go ahead and not give that one then, because that was definitely one of mine.
Oh, okay. Well, you've got the full quote there, so if you want to
go
more,
for
it. It made me think of a little Steve Martin in his book, and then also Feynman. I think they both had a sense of maintaining that amateur status in how they approached what they did. But yeah, the quote has a little more context with what you had after that.
Yeah. He elsewhere says, or he goes on to say, I'm not even sure that I comply with my own definition of a good teacher. He learned much, he taught more. Of one thing I'm certain, a good teacher can only have dissident pupils. And in this respect, I may have done some good. Okay. Yeah, I actually kind of agree with that too, because someone who teaches well gets people to think on their own, which means he's training a bunch of dissidents. Mm-hmm. So yeah, I can go with that. A few others from me, and these are mostly complaints about higher ed and the process there. Some of these were less applicable to the world of higher ed that he was in at that time. Although he says this is how it was when I was in Austria. He says there was an old student's saying back in Austria, because of the glut of the overproduction of scientific personnel for too few jobs. He says there was an old student saying. So let's put it this way. He says there were very few jobs. I'll start earlier. Otherwise, one entered a career in science. This is someone who studied science back in Austria, just as in history or philosophy, by trying to become a teacher at a college or even a high school. There were very few jobs, and almost none that paid enough to live on, except for the position of the professor himself. And there was usually only one professor for a discipline. And then here's where the quote that I very much appreciated came in. He said, hence the old students saying that there were only two ways to make a university career, per anum or per vaginam, or vaginum. Vaginam is a proper Latin pronunciation, classical Latin anyway. You tried to become the professor's darling, or you married his daughter. Otherwise, this limited the choice. Or obviously, this limited the choice. Some professors were very nasty. Some daughters were very ugly. Girl students were altogether out of luck, but there were only a few of them. So, wow. And as someone who is presently on the academic job market for my own field, I could talk the rest of the podcast about this. This is absolutely the case now particularly in the humanities in U.S. education, where there are way too many. There are far more PhDs being produced than there are possible jobs for them to fill. And so, you get right at this job cycle. There may be another couple jobs that post at this point, but the academic job cycle is such that it runs where jobs post in the fall, usually in the early fall, and then you have interviews usually around a central academic conference in the late fall or winter area, toward the end of the first semester of the academic year. And then you have on-campus interviews at the beginning of the next semester, and then you get offers or not at the beginning, or sometime after that, usually say February or March is when the cycle basically comes to conclusion. And then you get the division of the contingent labor positions, your adjuncts and so on, for those who didn't get anything, which is the vast majority after that. And of course, I love, you get questions from extended family and all that, like, or people, they find out, you've just finished a PhD or something, and it's like, oh, well, where are you hoping to get a job? Where do you want to live? Well, you see, that's the thing. There are 7 jobs on the market to which I can apply this cycle. Now, a couple more may add in, but that's 7, and that's nationwide. And there are going to be 3 or 4 others internationally that I could apply for as well. So you don't really have much choice on where you're going to live if you're going to stay in the field, and then you have 150 to 250 applicants for each one of those. So the odds of getting one are pretty slim. So this is right along the line of what he says is how things were in pre-war Austria, and he laments that, and then says things are headed there and worse in the U.S., and it has.
Yeah.
Couple other things. He says this is another piece that I completely I loved. He says the incredible twaddle let loose by all these computerized humanists. He complains that even the people in the humanities are now trying to take a scientific perspective to their disciplines, because this, what he regards as a sort of pseudoscientific approach, that the scientific approach to humanities is ultimately going to kill them and make them, dumber. He basically says the incredible twaddle let loose by all of these computerized humanists is probably not worse than that of the scientists. But since the former have only begun to develop a coterie jargon or an animal language of their own, they are still forced to use more or less intelligible words, and these give them away. Well, let me tell you, since 1978, that is no longer the case. That coterie jargon and animal language has been invented and has been perfected such that we don't have to use intelligible words in humanities anymore, and the twaddle has now actually, if not at least equaled, it has exceeded. I would say it has more realistically exceeded that of the scientists about which he is also complaining there. Some of the amount of incredible twaddle that I come across in the fields of the humanities and social sciences is remarkable. And he hits a home run on how he discusses that toward the end of the book. One last quote from me. I came to the conclusion that the degree of civilization of a country can be gauged from three things: how the people behave toward their children, their old, and their teachers. America fails in all three respects. And the Turks, for instance, appear to represent a much higher level despite inferior plumbing and less competence in automobile repair.
I underline that one. I like that one.
I love that measure of the civilization of a country, though. How do people behave toward their children, their old, and their teachers?
Mm-hmm.
That is wow. I love that quote in terms of how to gauge the degree of civilization of a country. And if that's the case, the U.S. has gotten worse since 1978. We've gotten less civilized.
Yeah.
And those are actually related too. Children, old, and teachers. All of that has to do with it's not just civilization. It has to do with respect,
mm-hmm.
and it has to do with having boundaries set so that people respect one another and pay one another honor as a result of their position in society, as whether it be a child who may be taken care of in different ways or preserved, an old person who is also vulnerable, and teachers who have vulnerable positions but are also paradoxically in positions of authority, and that puts them in an odd position. So I thought that was a brilliant insight there.
Mm-hmm.
So let's get to your favorite words. Now,
okay.
Definitely a favorite section of the podcast for me, at least.
Well, the first one is a good old German word. Fach idiot. Did I pronounce that correctly? Can you do that again?
Fachidiot.
Okay.
I mean, my German pronunciation isn't very good either, but it's, yeah.
Well, and it means professional idiot. So that one's that's probably the book of the or the word of the books of Titans so far, actually.
Yeah, that's up there. It actually reminds me of Nassim Taleb's notion of the intellectual yet idiot. He actually uses this as he uses this acronym all the time, the IYI, the intellectual yet idiot. And he says there's an entire class of intellectual yet idiot people out there. And
we need to make him aware of this word, because this rolls off the tongue a lot better than IYI or.
Yeah, I'll have to tweet. Maybe we should tweet Taleb this page number so that he can take a look at it, because this was right up Taleb's and actually, so much of what Chargaff says here is up Taleb's his particular ways of thinking and up his alley, where he talks about these intellectual yet idiot. It's actually he has an article describing the intellectual yet idiot on Medium, and he says, there's some really good things, but he says the intellectual yet idiot pathologizes others for doing things he doesn't understand without ever realizing that it is his understanding that may be limited. The intellectual yet idiot is a semi-erudite who thinks he is an erudite. He fails to naturally detect sophistry. And specifically, he says, the intellectual yet idiot is a production of modernity, hence has been accelerating since the mid-20th century to reach its local supremum today, along with the broad category of people without skin in the game who have been invading many walks of life. Why? Simply, in most countries, the government's role is between 5 and 10 times what it was a century ago, as expressed in percentage of GDP. The intellectual yet idiot seems ubiquitous in our lives, but still is a small minority and is rarely seen outside specialized outlets, think tanks, the media, and universities. Most people have proper jobs, and there are not many openings for the intellectual yet idiot class. So right up there with professional idiot, Fachidiot that Chargaff is going towards. So yeah, that Taleb's stuff on this is almost a direct echo of, and I'm not sure he's read Chargaff, but it's very much echoing the sorts of things that Chargaff is anticipating years earlier.
Well, it reminds me of the Feynman book where he's talking about the articles. He couldn't understand what the person was saying in the article because there was
Yes.
so much
Jargon.
superfluous language that he would just take one sentence at a time
And translate it into English.
Yeah.
People read. Oh, well, okay. And actually that gets right back to what I was saying about the twaddle with the jargon and the animal language has been invented. See, this is where Feynman was writing a little bit later than this, and see, by that point that stuff had come to pass in the humanities and social sciences, so things had gotten even worse.
Mm-hmm.
Hey, you got another one?
I got one more word. Delectation comes from a quote. I do not read for instruction, but for the delectation of the mind. And it just means abundant delight, pleasure and delight.
Yeah, it's the same root that we get delectable from.
Yeah.
Delectation is where the delectable, it's the receptors for the delectable.
Yeah.
Anyway.
Well, in this book, to me, it was a delight to read, so it was delectable.
All right, so let's go ahead and get to a little bit more detailed stuff. I mean, this section has always started to meld into our quotes at this point, just because we've gotten out of control with how many favorites we like from various books. But definitely some other things to discuss in more detail. Specifically, again, one of the primary themes of this book, if not the primary theme, is the direction of science and the way that he is decrying what he sees as the death of real science and the introduction of preferring explanations to understanding is one of the things that he talks about. But we should talk a good bit about this here, and what he says about science and its direction.
Yeah, and I'll go ahead and start by reading what his I guess idealized view of science from when he was a kid, or not a kid, but when he was starting off. When I look back on my early way in science, on the problems I studied, on the papers I published, and even more perhaps on those things that never got into print, I noticed a freedom of movement, a lack of guild-imposed narrowness, whose existence in my youth I myself, as I write this, had almost forgotten. The world of science was open before us to a degree that has become inconceivable now, when pages of application papers must justify the plan of investigating in depth the 35th foot of the centipede, and one is judged by a jury of one's peers who are all centipedists or molecular podiatrists. I would say that most of the great scientists of the past could not have arisen, that in fact most sciences could not have been founded if the present utility-drunk and goal-directed attitude had prevailed.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
for what this kind of takes what he thought of it in the past and then where he saw it going. And this is from page 104 of the hardback version. Science shook the shakable and confirmed the firm. Its use as an ideological weapon came later.
Yeah.
From there, he starts talking about science becoming a religion. And I thought that was very insightful, especially, one of the most discussed topics of today with science is climate change. And if you take a step back and look at how people are actually discussing it, it's in terms of belief, which is very striking and very odd for a system that's looking to create a hypothesis, test that, and then get rid of it if it's not valid. To all of a sudden, now we're talking. You are, if you don't believe in it, you're a denier. So he talks a lot about this becoming a religion. And in one of the quotes, considering the role of science in our time, generally agreed to be a flourishing as never before, I've not been able to decide whether its enormous ascendancy was the cause of or was caused by the disappearance of the religious sentiment.
Yeah, and he continues, there can, however, be little doubt that the whole complex of the natural sciences has become a substitute religion, fulfilling the double roles of mysterious incomprehensibility to the lay public and a means of livelihood for its practitioners. And I thought that was really profound. That the mysterious incomprehensibility to the lay public allows the practitioners of science, allows scientists to have the kind of authority that priests in prior eras might have had, as those who come into contact with the mysterious, and it gives them that kind of authority, and also provides a nice means of livelihood for those who may deal with it. So, and what he really is getting at, he's not critiquing science itself. What he's critiquing is scientism, which that distinction is that terminology isn't around in his day, but this idea that first of all, science can provide all the answers that we really need in life, and he very clearly explains that just isn't the case. That there are limits to what science can actually investigate, and secondly, that it has to do with science itself, or certain basically, again, getting to this idea of someone who, because they're a scientist, has authority by virtue of being a scientist, and therefore they should be listened to about all sorts of other things. And so, scientific theories and hypotheses get elevated to the level of myths that govern society, and that he thinks is a negative.
Yeah. And then and one more on science as a religion. The dogma of the infallibility of science has become so strong and generally accepted that measures of excommunication, customary in weaker churches, do not even have to be contemplated. It is presumably for this reason that I've been spared the fate of earlier heretics. The refusal of research grants is, in any event, a more effective form of interdict, a retribution from which, in the last few years, I've been far from being exempt.
Brutal.
So interesting points there of just the not even formally kicked out in terms of excommunication, but just not getting funding, and I know you've seen a lot of that in the university system of what gets funded gets promoted, and
there's all sorts of complicated incentives in place throughout the research apparatus of various institutions, and because and ultimately those incentives govern everything. So incentives matter, and when incentives are out of whack, the things that are incented those are the things that ultimately get pushed and get studied and, get additional hires and all these other things. So yeah, he's on the cutting edge of complaining about a lot of that. And he says, if you want to do science in a more pure fashion, which he also questions, how pure anything can really be. I mean, he's a skeptic about that to begin with, but he basically is complaining that a more pure type of science is unattached from and is more amateur. But it's more difficult to do in today's world, where it requires a good amount of money to have the necessary equipment to be able to do the kinds of study that you need to do to make breakthroughs and to understand how things work and all of that. So, he is very conscious of the polluting effect that money and various incentives that come along with that bring to science, but he also acknowledges that there's issues in terms of you can't really do without it either. So it's a problem.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, you had a lot of different things. Something else that stuck out to you big from the book.
Yeah, I mean, again, there are all sorts of different quotes and things that get to some of the things that he talks about here. I mean, I think one other thing that is really big on in terms of how he discusses science and where it's going and some of the things that he really disagrees with is he tries to draw a pretty significant distinction between understanding something, understanding what's actually happening, and having explanations for things. And he says, in general, it is hoped that our road, that is the road of science, will lead to understanding. Mostly, it leads only to explanations. And that distinction is one that I haven't really seen a whole lot, but I thought it was a really important distinction. That really understanding something means you get and you grasp the underlying principles and concepts and all of that behind it, which is beyond just having an explanation for it, where you can explain it, but you may not actually have the full grasp of it. And he wants to really distinguish between those. He talks about our understanding of the world is built up of innumerable layers, and each layer is worth exploring as long as we do not forget that it is one of many. So you can explain lots of things on one layer, but then as soon as you go down one layer, that explanation doesn't really cut it. And he wants to draw that distinction where science, he says, listen, what we can do, and even once we get explanations that work, that doesn't really mean we understand the thing that we're studying. We just can explain how certain things happen. And again, that's a distinction he makes when he talks about studying life and really understanding life. Well, you can explain how certain things happen genetically, but we still don't understand life at the deep level. And he really likes to highlight that point. And again, I think it's an important one because it does bring out that mystery that we need to, if we're going to be honest with ourselves, we have to understand that we don't understand that. And we don't have the tools developed at this point to be able to understand it. So yeah, he keeps getting into that in his evaluation of where science is going to. And he, further goes on and says, the availability of a large number of established methods serves, in fact, in modern science, often as a surrogate of thought. So instead of really thinking about something, he says, many researchers now apply methods whose rationale they don't really understand. Well, I'm going to apply this method to it. Well, why? Well, I mean, it's one option. Somebody else put this method together years ago, and if I apply it, I might get results. Well, that doesn't mean you actually understand the mechanisms at all.
So you as a professor, how do you test your students with that distinction?
That's a really hard thing.
Yeah.
That kind of assessment is hard. And part of it is that when you're assessing it, when you're grading it, you actually have to have someone who does understand or understands the limits of understanding to be able to detect, to sniff out whether someone else has gotten there. And there is a sort of art to it. And that is something that we're not comfortable with in a society that values empiricism so much, because you can't always empirically get to it. You have to be able to. There is a. It's sort of like the pornography explanation. I know it when I see it.
Mm-hmm.
Right. That is sort of where it ends up with in some cases. So the other thing that I thought, and I want to hear your take on some here too, is he really also goes after the what he refers to as the thoughtless, almost automatic use of science as the seed of technology. And that basically science has gone from investigating the mysteries of the world to trying to find explanations for how things work so that we can technologically improve upon them. And it's sort of an intermediate step toward engineering. And he sees the direction that some of these engineering solutions go as frightful and horrifying, most notably the atom bomb, where he's like, whenever we engineer this stuff, when we improve upon it, we always find ways to destroy things with it. We don't improve things. We just find more ways to take our worst natures and embody those.
Yeah, and that was a big turning point in his life. He says that 1945 was the year that changed his entire attitude about science, and it was because of the atom bomb.
Between the Holocaust and the atom bomb, he recognized pretty quickly that there were some factors at work here in that science couldn't provide a solution to, and in fact could only contribute to the exacerbation of those forces. That solutions couldn't be found in science because humanity has deeper problems that go beyond the empirical.
Mm-hmm.
So, yeah.
Yeah, with that, I don't know. The one thing that is interesting to me though is what we were talking about earlier, where kind of this idea of science becoming a religion, and you losing that talk of continual testing and it turning more into a belief system, and then even what we were getting into last week, where the tweet that you had about worldviews and how if certain theories on science are becoming a worldview for people, they may not. Someone with a differing worldview is not going to take on to that theory of in this case it was climate change. So that changing of language into more of a belief system and in a religion, I think is one of the real interesting things about the direction of science, and I'm sure that's been going on for a while, but he really talks about it a lot in this book and sees it happening kind of before him, and then obviously the experiences of his life led to that as well.
Yeah. There's not. I mean, I think we go much further there. We're going to start beating the dead horse, and that was one of my complaints. Actually, I enjoyed a lot of what he had to say here, but I did think that there were a number of repetitions,
Mm-hmm.
and he kind of went in circles in a few cases where, again, the book was a little bit overly repetitive in certain places.
Mm-hmm.
But sometimes when he did come back to something, return to it, he had some additional layers to what he had to say that actually made me appreciate the repetition. So it's a little bit of a give and take there. But yeah, he there was a lot in here. Anybody who is a part of the realm of higher ed in particular will find some things in this book that they'll go, yeah, well, that's kind of true. Such as his description: the production of academically trained people continued, this is in Austria, at a high rate, but there was no place for them to go. They had to be exported. Welcome to 21st century American universities. Yeah. I also kind of liked his pessimistic view of indolence as the only response to an absurd universe, given what he had seen in the 20th century. Uh, basically being indolent instead of trying to find solutions to things, just being willing to just sit back and do nothing is actually better. Because he says, indolence is a virtue if it prevents you from stirring the pot just for the sake of stirring. The do-gooders have done so much evil that not to do this kind of good has become a virtue. And again, that's referring to things like the atom bomb and the Vietnam War and so on. These things that are spurred by the desire to rescue the good side. And he's going, yeah, but like, what are you giving up to get there? Like, if that's what it means to do good, then do nothing. My God.
When it kind of it's his philosophy on life for himself as well. He talks about it over and over of, well, this kind of just happened to me, and then I didn't really decide on this, but I kind of fell into this, and he keeps going. He keeps talking about that over and over. I thought it was interesting that's his view on life. And so he didn't really seem like that strong type of personality either. That was, oh, I'm going to go out and do this, or I'm going to be a do-gooder, but just kind of let things happen. And then it seems like that's his, what he thinks might be a good idea on a grander scale as well.
Yeah. I think we can basically start wrapping it from there, because I think we've hit the detailed points that are worth discussing, and we can go ahead and start to move on. So, big picture stuff. Returning back to your reflections on the book from a larger end.
Yeah, I love this book. This was one of my favorites so far of the books that we've read, and even past that on the other Books of Titan stuff that I've read, this still is up there as one of my favorites. He's incredibly funny, very insightful. And it was just one of those books. It was a delight to read. I didn't want to put it down. The discussions on the direction of science were interesting, especially coming in 1978. And just overall, I loved reading about his early life in Austria and the things that attracted him to Austria. The music, just the things he experienced, the discussions, it sounded awesome. And so I loved reading about that. And then he just had an interesting life going through all these huge events and being on the front lines of a lot of them. To get his perspective was really nice. I do want to comment as well, if you are interested in reading this book, if you go to Amazon, it's like $70. But if you go to, we'll link it in the show notes, but it's a university site, and they have the book for $30 or $40, and then they also have a EPUB version for free. So if you want to read it in iBooks or your whatever you use to read digital books, you can get that there for free as well. So don't spend the $70. But if you do want the hardcover, it's $30 or $40, which is a little pricey compared to the other books we've been reading, but
just a little.
I loved it. Yeah.
Yeah, I enjoyed
What'd you
this
think?
book. I enjoyed this book too. I don't think I enjoyed it quite as much as you did. But there were a lot of similarities, a lot of things that paralleled, other authors that I've really appreciated in the past, like again Solzhenitsyn and certain places, and C.S. Lewis in some other places, and Feynman in some places. I mean, he's a lucid thinker, and someone who brings enough of a pessimistic kind of contrarian view that I think is worth reading. It's one that I definitely would recommend. It's not one that I found quite as delightful to read as perhaps you did. There were I enjoyed his use of and facility with language without question. And as someone who has studied all sorts of different languages as well, I really appreciated and enjoyed his references to different aspects of language and how language works, and differences with this language and that language, and how there's a better word here than there, etc. A lot of that stuff I could totally relate to and liked. Although I think he had more facility with more modern languages than I do. But
Yeah, he had 15 languages that he
that he had at least dabbled with at some point. Yeah.
Yeah.
And the advantage of being raised in the old gymnasium education back in Austria is helpful there, because he was probably at least 4 or 5 of those by the time he probably had at least 4 or 5 of those by the time he was a teenager. So that's pretty standard in those older educational systems. So, but yeah, I appreciated a lot of that. Again, I think it's a valuable book. It's one of those that again I would recommend, particularly given its the way that it has a very different message from so many of the kind of triumphalist types of perspectives that you'll see in, say, 21st century books. This is a nice reminder that not everything is as rosy as it seems, and it's a nice reminder that we may think that we're more civilized than past ages that were far worse than us, but in fact, have we just found ways to sanitize our incivility and actually make it worse while hiding it from ourselves, and these sorts of things. These sorts of critiques are I think worth reading for anybody, and again, I think it's one of the better books that we've read so far. So I'll definitely agree with that. Although again, I didn't perhaps enjoy it as much as some of the others, but
Yeah.
I think it's definitely one of the better books so far.
Well, one thing before we close out here, the title.
Ha.
What does
Yes.
it mean?
So Heraclitus, or Heraclitos, the Greek philosopher, he's a pre-Socratic Greek philosopher, believed that everything in the world ultimately was comprised of or made of the primordial element of fire. And so what he's getting at is this primordial, mysterious, the thing, he's alluding to the idea of beginnings beyond what we can study in science today. I think that's more or less the type of allusion that he's making in the title.
Okay. Because Heraclitus was also the guy who said, no man ever steps in the same river twice. And then the way up and the way down is one and the same. And Chargaff actually disagrees with him on that second quote on page 199 of the book. And then there was one. So I did like a search just for Heraclitean Fire. Is that how you say it? Because I've been in my head, I've been saying I've been saying Heraclitean Fire for the last 6 months in my head, and I just when you said it recently of how it's actually supposed to be pronounced, so I'm having trouble like remembering.
Right. Well, the problem is that in Greek it's Heraklitos,
mm-hmm.
right? And so. But that's one thing, because the I sound in Greek is an E, just like it used to be in English. But in English, when it's usually pronounced, people say Heraclitus, and then when they use it as an adjective, it's usually Heraclitean.
Okay. So there's a poem by Gerard Manley Hopkins, and the name of the poem is That Nature is a
Heraclitean Fire.
Heraclitean Fire, and of the comfort of the resurrection. And I linked to that. I can link to that poem from the in our show notes as well. But that was the only other reference I could find.
Yeah, but again, for Heraclitus, the idea is, again, the whole cosmos is comprised of fire. Fire is the first principle. It's a kind of atomism, or early concept of atomism, that everything is made of fire in some way, and fire changes into other elements. You have this cosmic cycle that, how that works. We don't have enough of Heraclitus to really understand, but basically he understands fire as that first principle that again, one of the things when he talks about when you put your foot into a river, you never step into the same river twice because the water flows, right? And that's one of the ideas that he has is that everything flows. Well,
Everything changes.
everything is always changing. That there is nothing in the material world that is permanent. And of course, fire is a great example of that, right? Fire is always moving. It's unpredictable in that sense. It's always constant, but it's always changing. And so fire works as the metaphorical, I think, really is the way to think about it. But is this metaphorical conception of first things and how the world actually works and what it's made of and all of that. So I think that's where, again, Chargaff is alluding to that kind of concept, that and to the mystery of that sort of nature. And again, he for Heraclitus, he's trying to he argues that everything is based upon a logos that is above. This logos is this conception of divine is the wrong word, but of ideal or eternal. It's an eternal principle, what we might call the law of nature or laws of nature. Everything works according to this principle. Everything came into being in accordance with that principle, but everything that is actually matter and material is always changing and is always it's constant but always changing, unlike logos, which is fixed. And so in this sense, he anticipates a little bit of where Plato goes with that. So anyway, there's a lot of background here, and it makes sense on why he would choose this, particularly again getting back to the mystery that goes beyond what we can actually assess in our modern scientific ways of thinking. It's a metaphysical concept.
All right. Well, that will do it for us today. Before we get out of here, a reminder, you can follow us at booksoftitans.com. We're on Instagram and Twitter at Books of Titans. And please subscribe to this podcast. We're in iTunes. You can get access to all of our previous episodes. This is episode number 20. So we actually have 20 past episodes because we threw in a special episode in there. So this is our 21st episode, but the 20th book that we discuss. We are in the Android marketplace, any podcast manager of your choice. Share it, rate it. Let us know how we're doing. We'd love to hear from you. Next week, we are discussing Once an Eagle by Anton Meyer. It's a novel about...
it's really 3 novels.
Yeah.
In one.
Yeah. But it's required reading at West Point for West Point cadets. So
War College, yeah.
Very, very... that'll be a good discussion. So join us again next week for that. On behalf of Jason Staples, I'm Eric Rostad, and this has been the Books of Titans podcast. Thanks for listening.
Keep reading, keep listening, and keep improving.
And don't be a fuck idiot.
I made this.